Everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Paideia Today. As always, I am Dr. Bill Friesen, and joined here, as always, by my colleague, Dr. Scott Masson. And today, we are talking about a poet who many would describe as one of the most important poets of the 20th century. There are many who would also insist that he is the most important poet of the 20th century, by whom I mean William Butler Yeats. Yeats is a prolific poet. He's an influential poet. And even though Dr. Masson and myself have our reservations about certain aspects of this poet, I think we agree quite solidly that he is a magnificent poet. He is enormously skilled. He's a tremendous craftsman. He addresses a great series of pressing, important, insightful ideas that shape the trajectory of the 20th century. And as such, we want to come around and talk about him extensively today. I believe, Dr. Masson, you have ready to go a reading of one of his most popular and best known poems, The Second Coming. I'll turn that over to you.
Yes, that's correct. So The Second Coming, this is often anthologized, and it seems to me worthy of an introduction to Yeats's poetry in general. So it's The Second Coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming! Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born.
Thank you, Dr. Masson. There's a lot to say in there. One of the first things I should say is that this poem, like many of his other poems, illustrates the sheer craftsmanship of W.B. Yeats. Whether or not you agree with his themes and thematic treatment of certain issues, you still have to admit that. So it's a beautifully structured, enormously intricate poem, as are many of his poems. It also uses, well, I have a lot of my students who ask me, there's a lot of Christian symbolism in here. We've got Bethlehem, we've got a second coming, we've got a birth, we've got the invocations of the Apocalyptic and stuff like this.
Mm-hmm.
So they asked me, was W.B. Yeats a Christian, and is this somehow a Christian poem? And I have to tell them, no, this is the use certainly of Christian iconography, Christian symbols, Christian history, to be sure. But the man himself and its subject matter are not. It's something very different, and you and I will have to get into that.
Mm-hmm.
Some of our listeners also may be aware of some of the lines of this poetry from the famous title of Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart, which is where many of our listeners will have known it from. But you can find this poem referenced in various ways in popular music, in classical music, in theater, in other works of literature. It's an extraordinarily popular poem. And then, of course, the question in the class becomes, why precisely is this poem so perennially popular? And that is the grounds for a significant discussion.
Yeah. All of which I agree to. Everything you've said there makes perfect sense to me. It so when we say, is it a Christian poem, and it's not, you say it's not. Aspects of it clearly are. Cognizance of Christian themes and ideas are clearly there. It's inconceivable that the writer would use this terminology without an acquaintance with Christianity, but he's certainly not an adherent or somebody that we would connect with Christian convictions. He was politically part of the Protestant ascendancy in the Republic before it was the Republic of Ireland, so part of the Protestant establishment there. But those parties, as it were, are as much familial and cultural as they are actually the product, I would say, of confessional belief by this point. It's almost different people groups. He's an interesting character insofar as he's one of the figures most strongly associated with Irish nationalism. And one of the poems we're not going to look at, Easter 1916, is a sort of an anthem for that Irish nationalism. So it's interesting that Yeats, who has a Protestant background, will, at least in terms of his own group of people, suffer the most by the coming republic, which becomes a Catholic entity more or less. And those who had socially been in the aristocracy, namely the Protestants, at least some Protestants, will lose out enormously with the birth of this new nation. But Yeats nonetheless celebrates it and brings it about. But the poem itself, I think you are right, although it sounds Christian, and I think for undergraduate students, when they're reading this poem and they've just read Eliot, who is a Christian poet, but doesn't use Christian references, they come across Yeats, who does, and you say the one's a Christian, the other isn't, and they're baffled by that fact. Those two things together. Here we have a non-Christian who is making Christian references, and then we have a man who is a Christian who isn't. Now, to be fair to Eliot, the poems that are usually read, including the ones that we read ourselves in the last episode, were belonging to phases before he was a confessional Christian, before that, right? So that's to be understood. And later on, when he writes something like the Four Quartets, we can most certainly see his Christianity explicitly expressed there. But still, it's confusing to our contemporary audience, in part because what we're seeing here is the gradual divorce of the Western mind from Christianity. So its trappings are still there. Its knowledge of biblical language and story and even symbols are there, and they will be important for other writers and thinkers in the period. So psychology is not conceivable without Christianity. With Freud or Jung, they have a religious understanding, at least on some level, without adherence to it. And that would go for all of the writers and thinkers of the day. But that doesn't mean that they're Christian. And so the second coming, the sort of, as you say, apocalyptic notes here, belong to something different than the idea that Christ is coming again for the second coming. It's more along the lines of the terrible destruction of the world, and probably fitting with the end of the First World War and the terrible sense of the decline and fall of the West, the Oswald Spengler type sentiment.
Yeah. So the people you're talking about here, Yeats, Jung, Freud, the list goes on here. These are people who are either indifferent to Christianity or hostile towards Christianity, but they've inherited the language and symbols of Christianity with which to write, with which to think, with which to speak. And so that language, and that sort of Christian vocabulary gets turned to other uses, uses sometimes at odds with traditional Christianity. You mentioned the apocalyptic in here, and I think this is very much to the point and is perhaps one of the appeals of the poem. Yeats is living through a time which sees tremendous upheaval, and much of it is on a vast scale, and much of it is violent and deadly and destructive. So the apocalyptic is a natural sort of lens through which to view one's experiences at this time in history as we move into the 20th century through the Great War and everything that comes out of that. Yeats himself did not live to see the Second World War. He died in January of 39, if memory serves. And of course, September of 39 is when World War II gets underway. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, everybody saw the writing on the wall, so to speak. Oh, yes. And so I'm sure he knew that that was coming yet again. But this is a poem that is long before any of that. But I will note something else here. Since at least the time of Roman literature, this notion of the decline of the present age and the coming of the end of all things is a standard trope that you encounter in Roman, that is to say, Latin literature everywhere. They just expected that it would oftentimes crop up in these works of literature. The question wasn't whether or not these notions of the decline and these notions of the coming apocalypse, of the end of all things, it wasn't whether or not these were original expressions, but rather the originality was found in what you did with such things, with such notions. Yeats was a very keen student of history. Writers like Wilhelm Dilthey and people like this had a great influence upon his thinking. And it's important to think about this, especially when we're talking about cycles and gyres and things like this, that Yeats was convinced, albeit speculatively, that history operated very much not in a straight line, but very much in the sort of a trajectory of a corkscrew, that it would move forward in time in some senses, but there would be repeated patterns. And the patterns he was particularly interested in this whirling gyre, were a movement from barbarism to an eventual achievement of high culture, which would then, in his words, descend back into depravity and decadence, and then from there back into barbarism. Complicating that thinking is also this notion that different aspects of history could be at different stages simultaneously. So you could have a culture which was at its absolute height in terms of technology, but be down in the absolute basement of barbarism when it came to moral history or artistic history or something like that. So his thinking about history was actually really quite complicated. And so anytime you encounter these sorts of historical notions, you know that this is the kind of machinery that is undergirding much of his thinking around these sorts of things. And obviously in the second coming, we have the apocalyptic. So we're down there descending into the barbarism and the darkness and the things that come. But it's in doing so, in going after this notion of the apocalyptic, Yeats is going after a notion which is of fascination universally to the human mind, across time and across cultures. We've always been interested in this sort of thing. Yeats simply picks up on that and runs with it in a very original way, I would argue.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I also think it's worth mentioning to listeners of Paideia today, in part because I think those senses of apocalyptic, the world's coming to an end, are very strong at present after years of lockdown and COVID and so forth, and the anxieties that have arisen about that. This idea that although it seems like this is unprecedented, and of course a worldwide lockdown is unprecedented on that front, but the idea is that the world's a terrible catastrophe is coming are not necessarily new, and have been experienced many times historically and have been reflected upon. And I think there's something to be gained from that, other than that it really is coming to an end. For Christians, the idea of a second coming is one which is longed after and not one which is feared. I don't get the sense in Yeats here that this second coming is particularly anything other than harmful.
I think that's right. I think that's true.
There's a drastic pessimism here, which is a fatalism almost akin to your Norse kin and kith there, Bill, and that the doom and gloom there in Yeats are the product of a very different spirit than that of Christianity.
I think that that's true. I mean, you hear it said that every generation thinks, quote, that the end is nigh, and you'll hear their old people in particular lament this particular lament. And if our younger readers live long enough, doubtless they will hear their parents and their grandparents make noises of a similar sort, if they're not making these noises already. But, and of course, oftentimes people mention that when every generation thinks that the end is nigh, of course, most of them are wrong. But as a student of the Dark Ages, of which we've gone through 3, I can tell you at least a few times they weren't. So that kind of colors one's thinking on these matters. But this is a poem that belongs to a later period in his life. Just for the sake of clarity here for our listeners, Typically, the critics separate the poetic career of Yeats into three broad, rough phases. And there's a lot of argument about exactly what each phase entails. But just in a nutshell, his first phase, his most youthful phase, is oftentimes known as sort of an extremely self-conscious period of romanticism, which is the kind of thing you would expect from a young man, a young writer, a young poet. And in this, he's heavily influenced, predictably, by the Romantics.
Shelley in particular, and Blake,
Blake
yeah.
and Shelley, play
Yeah.
a very, very significant role in his thinking. Some of Shelley's spiritual thinking also bleeds over into Yeats, along with Blake, who has some eccentric ideas, to be sure. Another major influence on him at this period is Edmund Spenser, who we have not been fortunate enough to cover in Paideia today yet, something I regret, because he is absolutely magnificent, but we only have a scope for so much time. Spenser, just briefly, was a poet of the English Renaissance. He spent much of his life in Ireland and saw himself as being heavily influenced by Irish culture, the Irish landscape, all things Irish, though he also identified with all things English. So Edmund Spenser lived, as it were, with a foot on either side of the Irish Sea. And this Yeats found rather galvanizing, because he himself was descended ultimately from English roots, though his family had lived in Ireland for at least 200 years by the time Yeats came along. So he, again, is identifying with either group, and ultimately in his second phase, which is his nationalistic phase, as you've already alluded to, he identifies himself strongly and aggressively and unrepentantly to Irish nationalism. He is identified by many, many scholars as one of the greatest mouthpieces of Irish literature, full stop, never mind the 20th century. He gets mentioned alongside people like Joyce and what you will. So he's seen very much as a national treasure as well when it comes to these sorts of things. The second period, of course, is the period where we find poems like 1916 and what have you.
Yeah.
He falls madly in love, speaking of romanticism, he falls madly in love with a particular woman at this period who is going to have a considerable influence on his life and on his thinking. I'm speaking here about Maud Gonne, Gonne, who was a famous Irish nationalist, a violent Irish nationalist, as well as an actress. On numerous occasions throughout his life, Yeats would ask her to marry him. She would always turn him down. Ended up marrying somebody else ultimately, and that marriage ended very badly indeed. But the nationalism of Maud Gonne, conflating with his romantic interest in her, has a very profound effect on the poetry of this period. The other person in the middle period we should talk about just briefly here is somebody known as Lady Gregory, who belongs to the aristocracy, on the other hand, which places Yeats in a strange position socially, because he spent numerous, not summers, but he spent a fair bit of time at her country estate, enjoying the aristocratic life of an Anglo-Irish. And there he became convinced of the virtues of Irish aristocratic life. And this brings me to my point here. By the time he gets to the end of his nationalistic phase in the middle of his life, Yeats had become convinced that the values that shape his poetry, the only real values he could find out there culturally, were in the people at the bottom level of Irish society, oftentimes Catholic, and people at the very top of the Irish social hierarchy, that is to say, the aristocrats. He said very famously,
Protestants.
Yes, and he said famously that the only real living traditions of values existed at the top and the bottom, and that's where he wanted to locate himself, and that's where he wanted his influences to come from. The aristocrats at the top, and the people down, the common people down at the very bottom. The middle class, as has now become a common motif in the 20th century, is despised. He said they have no real living cultural traditions that guide their day-to-day life. They're dead, they're bankrupt. So he would come to the same conclusions that T.S. Eliot did later on. This also informs, because he's writing for this lower demographic, when he writes something like Easter 1916, you and I were discussing this before we began recording, that the poem is disappointing at the level of art and craft compared to something like The Second Coming. And I suspect, though I can't prove decisively, that one of the reasons for the simplicity of the poem is precisely because he's pitching it to a particular audience in this case. He wants to get certain important sentiments out there in poetic form that can be easily understood by these people down here. And as such, your average Irishman knows Easter 1916 very well indeed. It is a popular poem in Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps he was very effective at that.
What's the third phase, Bill?
The third phase is sometimes known as either the epigrammatic, or I like to think of it more of his metaphysical phase. He gets into, well, Yeats had always been interested in
his own private mythology.
The occult, the spiritual, what we would anachronistically now call New Age spiritual beliefs and things like this. He was very much an experimenter on this front.
Seances and so forth, right?
Yeah, he belonged to a lot of extremely esoteric spiritual groups and coalitions and things like this. So he identified heavily with South Asian theosophical movements. He was an ardent pantheist, an aggressive pantheist, to be sure. He was a Rosicrucian. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of that, but he was deeply involved in that. He was into seances, as you said. He belonged to the Golden Dawn, and was in regular contact with people like Aleister Crowley and people like this back in the day.
It's a nasty piece of work.
Yeah, and so he was deep. He was not casually involved in the occult and the spiritual. He was deeply involved in the occult and the spiritual. This shapes a lot of his thinking at the end of his career in particular. And when he married the woman who actually did say yes to him, Georgia, I can't remember her last name. It's a hyphenated last name.
Hyde Lease.
Thank you. Yes. She was literally half his age. He was 51, I think, and she was 25. He had 2 children by her and then went on to have a great range of affairs in his old age. But one of the things that he and his young wife got into was automatic writing, which is indebted to Freud, where you basically write whatever's going on and you try to get down writing as you go down to layers of the subconscious. You trace your way through the ego, the id, the superego, stuff like this. And you sort of channel by way of this automatic uncritical writing some kind of spiritual forces that guide you and what have you. And by way of this automatic writing, in kind of a seance trance, he writes his artistic thesis called A Vision. And I can't recommend to our readers that you spend the time or the money reading A Vision, because it's really, really difficult to understand. There's a lot of counterintuitive stuff in there. Most people, after having got halfway through A Vision, put it down and say, well, at least he was a great poet. And I'm inclined to agree with them. But there are some of his later poems which cannot be interpreted without access to his theories in A Vision. So some students complain that Yeats is an extremely hard poet in his later years, especially to understand and to make sense of. And I have to agree with you. It's true. His poems are extremely Byzantine at times.
Yes, and I do think he's an occultist, probably in every sense of the word. You
Yes.
mentioned the pantheism. What that means is that he does not think that there are really such things as good and evil, that it's more or less a scale or shades of the same entity. It's a matter of perspective, what one calls good and evil, really, and that what one person describes as evil, another person might call as their good, and he's not going to distinguish that. You mentioned Aleister Crowley. Crowley is very much devoted to magic, and I think you could see the same thing in Yeats, and the belief that almost his poetry was invoking a sort of a magical there's an incantatory quality to Yeats's poetry, which we both agree is one of the things that makes his poetry so fine, is he has a wonderful ear and a turn of phrase. But all the same, I think that there is something that's rather to my mind, dark about this. It is, so sex is a sacrament for Yeats, for Crowley, and there are various iterations of that and expressions of it. And readers can look that up for themselves. I'm not going to spend airtime talking about the lurid nature of those beliefs, but Aleister Crowley, it will make your hair stand on end if you have any. For Yeats here, I think that will come at a later period in life, but you can see the early origins here in this poem, The Second Coming, where he is speaking about spiritus mundi and so forth. Spiritus mundi being hard to say. It's the spirit of the world, the collective soul of the universe expressed in myth and legend and so forth. And so there's this aim throughout Yeats's career to create, as I said, a private mythology in the same way that we could see in William Blake, which makes both poets, quite frankly, not just recondite, but almost impossible to understand their clear meaning. Their clear meaning is in their mythology. There is no way of translating that to say, well, what's he really trying to say here? What he's really trying to say here is the arcane expression that you meet on the page, and you're not going to be able to translate it. So when, as I say, if you teach a class of undergraduates and they ask you what the poem is about, which is almost invariably the question, it's like, I can't translate it for you into a rational form that is going to make it comprehensible to you. You have to accept the language that he uses and get some sense of what these terms mean for him. So here it is a collective soul of the universe, and it's been experienced and it's expressed and testified to by other writers of the period like James Fraser in The Golden Bough, and Carl Jung will pick up on this in his ideas of archetypes and so forth. It becomes very influential on Canadian critics like what's his name at Northrop Frye, Victoria College. He comes up with a whole theory of poetry on this. Frye, who did his first major work on William Blake as well. So there's very much in the 20th century this move towards an embrace of poetry as a form of magic, and magic here as a form of control of the natural environment. So they depart from the idea that the Bible is the word of God, and they replace that with the idea that human words have some sort of capacity to control the cosmos. That's the general point of departure there.
Yeah, at the end of his life, he said very famously, if you're into Yeats, he said very famously that a man can embody the truth, but he cannot know it. And I think that actually goes a long way to explaining what we're looking at on the page with a lot of his poems, where trying to paraphrase precisely what it is that he's driving at is almost impossible. And yet there's something there which is nevertheless tangible in some other way that is perhaps beyond human language. This is always a struggle that any good poet has. They push themselves to the limit of language, and then how do they articulate meaning and value? Eliot struggled with this. W.B. Yeats struggles with this. Auden struggled with this. This shouldn't come as a surprise to us. I will say a couple of other things here, riffing off of what you've said, because I like this. The notion that in an age of seemingly exponential technological progress, that we should find a groundswell of superstition paralleling it, itself is a tendency which has prior iterations in Western history. We see this, for instance, during the Renaissance, when there's an explosion of learning. And to the modern thinker, perhaps counterintuitively, it seems, there is simultaneously an explosion of superstitious thinking, activity, stuff like this. Yes. A lot of people think that that was given over more to the medieval period. No. When in point of fact, historical records indicate that actually no, by far the more superstitious and occult-centric of the two eras was the Renaissance period itself. This is when you see the big explosion of witch burnings and stuff like this. And this is when we start coming across compendiums of magic and alchemy and things of that sort.
Well, the witch burnings arise because there are people who profess to be witches, though. This is right. So it's not just, we talk about the witch burnings, but really there's a rise in the belief in the occult and magic and so forth.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think was quite astutely pointed out by C.S. Lewis was that in ages of high technology, only the specialists fully understand how the technology works. The rest of us approach this whole world, this great complex web of technology, not knowing how almost anything around us brings us the wonders that are brought. And so the mind intuitively reaches rather back for taking things on faith in a relatively religious sense. For instance, I don't understand how this computer is working in all its details right now. I take it on faith that somebody who is specialized in this knows how to handle these things, knows why the recording functions as it does, knows why the internet functions as it does. But I have to take a lot of things on faith.
Yes.
And this is very much a hallmark of the technological age. And so it doesn't come as any surprise that in one of the most explosive technological jumps forward in history, the beginning of the 20th century, we should find a parallel burst of superstitious interest. The other thing I want to mention very briefly here is that something else which seems new is actually very old. A lot of what Yeats and Crowley and all his friends got into when it came to studies in the occults and occult activity basically looks and functions a lot like Gnosticism. That is to say that there is a body of religious spiritual knowledge which is revealed to an elect few who then can or will not share it with others in their mix. And there's a hierarchical structure of who's spiritually superior, depending on how much knowledge you have in certain esoteric fields and what have you. That's a very, very old tendency on the part of humans. This is not a new thing, again, that Yeats is getting into with the Golden Dawn and all these sorts of things. And again, Gnosticism tends to rise at certain points in history. When history is in crisis, Gnosticism seems to burst out in ever new iterations. If you've studied your history of Western culture and thought, you'll see that what's happening at the beginning of the 20th century with Yeats and his people is very, very similar to old patterns of Gnosticism in many senses.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you mentioned Lewis on this. He notes that the modern scientist and the belief in technology very much mirrors the same pattern of, what he calls scientism. Yes. Rather than science. We don't have a problem with science. We do have a problem with scientism, which is basically we should trust those who wear the white cloak of the scientist and say that science is because I say it is and I'm a scientist. So these sort of self-reflexive appeals to authority that really are not grounded in anything that could be probed or questioned. So there's an authoritarian dimension to that as well. Now, Yeats, interestingly, you mentioned the nationalism. Let's talk as well about the fact that he not only indulges in Irish nationalism, but also becomes explicitly in some ways an admirer of a fascist. Not the one that immediately comes to mind, to most people's minds at any rate, Adolf Hitler, because as you said, that he dies right before the Second World War. He would have, of course, heard of Hitler because Hitler had come to power in 1933. But Benito Mussolini in Italy, very much of an admirer of Mussolini and the characteristics of fascism. Do you want to say something about that, Bill?
Yeah,
I think it's interesting there. Again.
Yeah, I don't want to engage too much in the old deconstruction impulse of tearing somebody's reputation down, but this is something that does tend to get swept under the carpet oftentimes in conversations. Towards the end of his life, Yeats is unapologetically in sympathy and indeed even excited by what's happening with fascism in his world. And as you've said, he is particularly exercised by what's happening in Italy underneath Benito Mussolini and the fascists there, the black shirts and all this sort of thing. There is a similar movement in Ireland of relatively fascistic individuals known as the blue shirts. He gets involved with that movement. He writes marching songs for Benito Mussolini's fascists, which are never used, by the way. He was all on with fascism. And one of the main avenues of this relationship with Mussolini, or at least Mussolini's fascist regime, was through another poet. We've mentioned him tangentially on a few cases, in a few instances now. I mean, Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound found himself in Italy during World War II and happily engaged in promoting fascism to the West by way of the radio. in numerous radio shows and programs and what have you. He was a full-on fascist mouthpiece during the years of bloodshed and horror. At the end of the war, he was interred as a war criminal and spent years being interred as a war criminal. And then eventually, I think if memory serves me, he fled to the United States when he finally got out, because nobody in Europe would touch him with a 10-foot pole. He was absolutely radioactive and toxic. Yeats, I can only wonder what would have happened had he survived to the end of World War II. Would he have changed his views on fascism? It doesn't seem likely. Would he have entered into sympathy? Would he have simply gone silent? I don't know. But this is an awkward bit of Yeats that we don't like talking about if we like his poetry. And I think you and I do agree that we do like his poetry. So we find ourselves in the odd position of admiring the art of the man while remaining profoundly skeptical about some of the values that drove the poet himself.
So let's say something about the poem. So we read The Second Coming, and we only read it, but we didn't actually analyze any of the symbols there or talk about the features that we said were evocative. Why don't we say a few things about it? So it starts off with a very interesting image there. You said a gyre, I said a gyre. Not quite sure. You're the Anglo-Saxonist, so you've chosen that, whatever. But at any rate, it is a circle that gets broader and broader. And if you've ever watched a falcon go up in the sky, that's what it does. It keeps circling higher and higher, and then it stoops and it falls at an extraordinary speed upon its prey. Here he envisages this falcon as something that it's clearly symbolic, because and I suspect and have always understood it to some degree to represent humanity, and the falconer being something akin to God. But that's because that's the way I tend to read it and tend to interpret things, so I will read it as a Christian. I'm not sure that Yeats intends that, but he can't contradict me either, not only because he's dead, because there's nothing in the poem to forbid that interpretation either. And I think most people have that strong sense that the falcon, there's a loss of purpose, and there's a sense of a detachment from the meaning and purpose of life. And as a consequence, we get the famous line that things fall apart and the center cannot hold. And most people, when they read the poem, are reflecting upon the loss of meaning and purpose in Western culture. The center cannot hold. There's an extremism, whether you see it on the communist left with the rise of the Bolsheviks in, let's say, in Russia in 1917, or with the rise of the fascists on the other side. But the center is not there anymore. The center cannot hold, and mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. Yes. And there's a blood that is loosed, as a bloodlust and a blood-dimmed tide is loosed. And the famous phrase, the ceremony of innocence is drowned. It's a wonderful line.
There's so much going on there. You're right. The center cannot hold. You have these ever polarizing voices in camps. If you're a student of history, you'll know that the first people up against the walls, either under the communists on the one hand or the Nazis on the other hand, tended to be the moderates, not the extremists. It was the people who were saying, calm down, be reasonable, let's in a civilized way, who were the first ones to get shot.
And people wonder why there are no voices of reason in our day.
Well, we're in an age of polarization ourselves, perhaps you could argue. So again, this is a timely poem in some senses. I like.
Why do people in the middle get shot, Bill? What's your thought? Your immediate thought?
Well, they don't want, both of the extreme sides don't want their messaging to get watered down by people telling them to calm down. They need to articulate things and do things that are very extreme and say things that are very extreme in order to compensate with the other side's growing or escalating extremities. And if somebody takes the power out of that punch, like a moderate, then they're going to be on the back foot. They're going to be in trouble. So there's a deep sense of urgency and emergency in saying it as aggressively and violently and powerfully and extremely as you possibly can, almost like a strident defensive measure, I suspect. This is just me thinking out loud now. By the way.
I was asking for an out loud thought. I'm not quite sure what the answer is myself, other than that it serves a purpose, and the purpose is
it's very consistent. It's very consistent.
It is, and it pushes people away or draws them to you. So if you thought about not coming to the conclusions we want you to come to, namely to be radical, we're going to encourage you to do so.
Yeah.
Bang.
And,
So don't walk away from us. You stay right close to us, and you're going to be part of our movement, or else.
or
Look what
else.
happened to that guy.
Yeah, in an age where we're being encouraged to say ever more extreme political things or be ostracized and worse, we see the dynamic playing out right now. And so do I say this over the top thing, which I don't even possibly agree with on any level, moral, intellectual, and so on? I may have to, otherwise I'm going to visit that wall in question.
And so his concluding line there, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity, is almost a descriptive phrase.
Those two lines really of the entire poem, those are the two that resonate with me, and I know many readers
And
the
me,
most.
yes.
Yeah.
And everyone.
Yeah, so I find myself on certain sides of issues, and the people around me are so uncommitted, uncaring, bland, milquetoast, that it's really difficult to find a passionate ally in these sorts of things. But the sides that are urging really extreme measures and what have you, those people are full of passionate intensity all the time. Why is it that we can't respond from a more reasonable, moderate position with equal strength? But we can't. So we're left with people who lack conviction. This is a great age of people who lack convictions. We saw this leading up to World War I. Yeats is signaling it again later on, and you could argue we're seeing it again right now. The best lack all conviction. That truly resonates. As to the Falcon and Falconeer, I interpreted that a little bit differently, but like you, it has to remain incredibly speculative. You can't measure it like you would measure the meaning and value of a T.S. Eliot poem. It's very esoteric. I saw this as the Falcon as some kind of the spirit of a spiritual and artistic quest, which has become unmoored from he who is on the quest. These two things are separating. There's a split of psyche. Maybe we're getting Freudian again. I'm not entirely sure what it is. Obviously, the widening gyre to me immediately evokes this model of history. So Yeats is thinking historically, where are we going right now as a people, as a culture, as an economy, as a political entity?
But he's breaking with the Whig view of history, the model of progressive improvement. He's
Yes.
departing from that quite clearly and radically at that, and reverting to more of a pagan view, as in the ancient classical world view of the Romans and the Greeks.
Yes, this is not an ever ascending climb in history. This is in no way progressivist, and this is actually telling about the 20th century, because the 20th century blew up such models with such violence and horror that you could no longer hold to a progressivist model of history in your mind. So what do? You adopt either the cyclical patterns or the gyre patterns, the corkscrew pattern of history, moving from disaster to high culture, back to disaster again. Which is a little bit depressing, but it's a more viable model of history than what had gone before, as you say. The shocking thing is that even nowadays, we seem to be moving back once more, I think for the third or fourth time since the 18th century, to progressivist models of thinking and feeling when we talk about certain historical tendencies. So we're back again, and again, it's another timely moment for Yeats to be writing a poem like this.
Yeah, it's interesting, Bill, that you should say that. There is certainly in politically an appeal to progressive models of improvement and so forth on the political level, but culturally, I don't see that same thing being repeated. So there's a dissonance at the moment on that front. You'll see far more cynical views of humanity being expressed in popular culture, like in Game of Thrones and so forth, and not just that, but those sorts of quasi-historical or symbolic presentations of human nature. You don't get the decided sense that things are improving. You get the decided sense that actually the appeals to progress are just masks for base, cynical motivations. That's what's being conveyed in popular culture at the moment, is that the sort of virtue signaling towards progress is nothing but a fraudulent cloak for, as I say, selfish motives. That
Well,
and that's alarming.
it functions as exactly that. It's a cheap proxy for real moral, ethical, and spiritual convictions. Our ethics and morals are no longer particularly educated in many circles. They
Yeah,
are
what the thing I object to about Game of Thrones is that it suggests that contemporary cynicism and a lack of any conviction about matters like justice is true of the world and was always true of the world, particularly that of the ancient world or the medieval world. And I think that this is mendacious and false and extraordinarily historically ignorant.
Well, I am rather curious as to how Yeats would respond to, because I was thinking of the sheer ugliness in every respect of the word of a lot of modern art and entertainment, which it is. Clearly, there is a taste for the hideous and violent and ugly. It sells well. Game of Thrones is a good case in point, but we could give you hundreds of other examples of this kind of thing.
Oh yes.
And the ugliness at the entertainment level is pitching course to the masses. It's the bottom denominator giving us ever more extreme doses of violence, ugliness, depravity, and so on. And this is what is selling. But we find it at the top end of the spectrum as well socially. High art, if you go to galleries and things like this, you can go to a lot of exhibitions and things like this and see stuff that is not only not beautiful, but breathtakingly ugly, again, in every sense of the word. I think back to that German exhibit that involved rotting meat and stuff like this. And it was the toast of the town. Everyone thought it was brilliant. No one could tell you why, but they thought it was brilliant. So these are the two levels of society that Yeats was particularly galvanized by: the living traditions, the tradition of values, cultural values at the bottom and at the top of society. And now we find this kind of willful depravity and ugliness at both the bottom and the top. How would he respond to that? What would he make of that? Would this fill him with a degree of dismay, or would he just embrace this as the natural cycle of things? I don't know. But I know that it would agitate the man's thinking.
But again, this is what I said about pantheism. He would say that it's a matter of perspective there. The ugly, the things that you're describing as unspeakably awful, they may be the very things that he thinks are worth celebrating because they're held with such vehemence and strength. And so we may deplore the fascist tendencies that Yeats lauded, but he would say that they have a great deal of power and potency about them, and they're bringing about the sort of change which is necessary. The very same thing that you'd hear coming out of Nietzsche's mouth about the Übermensch, right? So he's the man who has the will to power, who is going to put himself above and beyond all concepts of good and evil. He is a law unto himself.
Yeah, when you adopt a cyclical model of history, this is one of the things that can happen. You can end up saying that this is the spirit of my age,
Yep.
spiritus mundi, whatever you want to call it. Spirit of the world is how that translates, of course, as you said quite rightly. And this is what's appropriate to the time because it's a cycle. But of course, it also makes an absolute mess of the moral and ethical superiority and preening of our modern age. I mean, this is an assumption that is everywhere in modern culture, that we are somehow morally and ethically better than previous generations. We know better, as if we're the recipients of some kind of Gnostic knowledge ourselves. But Yeats would very likely argue with this notion. You mentioned Nietzsche, by the way. Nietzsche had a profound influence on Yeats.
Yep.
As did, by the way, in his early days, the Neoplatonists, but that's a different conversation. There's a tension, by the way, also I should mention, in Yeats' poetry between abstract and concrete. He really wrestles with that, but that, of course, is a typical kind of wrestling match that we find many of the authors at the beginning of the 20th century engaging in. So it's no surprise to see Yeats doing it as well. He's very galvanized by this notion of the tension between the concrete and the abstract, the symbol and what is symbolized by the symbol, and so on.
Yeah, so that's you mentioned earlier Byzantine. We were going to get to this. I'm not sure we'll have time now. A couple of poems by Yeats, Byzantium and Sailing to Byzantium, and for some reason Byzantium occupies a particular place in Yeats's poetic mental framework. And it's interesting to me that he should appeal to Byzantium. In some sense, I think it's the sheer beauty of Byzantium that appealed to him, the golden backgrounds, the beauty of the art and the culture, the enduring nature of the culture. But of course, we also get from that the intricate and Byzantine rules that accompany that, and impenetrable bureaucracy that we associate with the word Byzantine as well. I think all of those are there for Yeats and are both appealing and repelling at one and the same time. But I'm not sure we want to get into those poems per se, but note that all of these things are part of Yeats's field of reflection. And at the same, for me, the poem that I would take from Yeats, the one poem, is the one we've already read, as a reflection on not just Yeats, but the whole of the 20th century. There is this sense of terrifying apocalyptic doom about the age. And for
Yeah.
some, it's exciting, and Yeats seems to be one of those. And for others, it's absolutely devastating, and they're paralyzed by it and defeated and deflated and go down the nihilistic direction that I don't think Yeats ever does.
Yeah, the sheer pessimism of the first half of the 20th century, and indeed the fin de siècle that preceded it, back to 1890, in my view, are distinctives of the age. There are those who embrace the coming whirlwind and those who are thrown into absolute despair and despondency by the age. But it's nevertheless a feature of the age.
But note those things that we spoke of. It departs from a rational Christian view of life. There's no rationality really being held. So science for Yeats is not something particularly interesting. Technology might be, because there's a symbolic appeal to technology, and it arises concurrent with the rise of magic, and to some degree it's an age of both technology and magic. There's that sort of features. There's what you talked about, which is the Gnosticism, the spiritual elite that are there, and Yeats would account himself one of them in some ways. He's the poetic expression of that phase. At the same time, there's a perversity about this period and an appeal to clearly occultic practices, perverse sexual rites and so forth, and a attribution of profound significance to those things. So it's all of the sorts of things that you see in scripture that are directly connected with Babylon and with the Old Testament Canaanite practices. So sexual rites to appease the deities, whether it's the Baal or the Asherah poles or so forth. You get this sort of return in contemporary culture, right in the midst of a scientific, technological age. The poets and the thinkers of the day are very much indulging in seances and all manner of other things. And I think those things are worth noting, and they often are not noted when we're talking about the poets, but I think that they ought to be and should be, because there is, even though they depart from Christian religion, they have not thrown aside all spirituality. In fact, they're full on into spirituality as a replacement for that. And I'm not sure there's any way of replacing the spiritual itch that mankind has, other than putting something in God's place. And it usually is, if it's not God himself, is a lurid thing.
Yeah, again, this is, I think I mentioned this last podcast right at the end. A lot of my students are surprised to discover that an obsession with the occult and superstitious matters, more generally speaking, spiritualism, if you like, doesn't operate in a steady state. A lot of people think that this obsession with the occult and things of this sort of new age sort is something that, again, has been steadily rising to our modern age, when in point of fact, it operates, again, much more like a sine wave. There are periods of complete obsession out there in cultural circles with the occult, and then relatively lean, mean, straightforward period. So as we get to the end of the 30s, and then again, as we move into the 50s, there's not a huge amount of mainstream cultural interest in the occult. But then as we move into the 60s, it explodes again into whatever that age is. It diminishes again in the 80s. It rises again towards the end of the 90s. It's all over the shop. And Yeats is at one of the high points, the crest of an obsession with the spiritual, with the occult, and the things that go along with it. I want to also pick up on this before we forget this here, that Yeats is increasingly living in an age where we were talking about depravity and things falling apart and stuff like this. We now do live in an age where solidly the market appeal of either entertainment or the artistic respectability of works of art in 2021 seem to show little to no interest in the traditional markers of these sorts of things, the good, the true, and the beautiful. We're just not interested in them for the most part as a mass culture.
That's because people are pantheists and they don't believe that the good and the true and the beautiful are anything other than perspectival things.
Yes, they're told again and again in middle school, high school, and in university.
There is no such thing.
That these judgments of what is good, what is true, and what is beautiful are all purely relativistic. You and I have been slowly exploring the devolution of how we got here. And we saw this with some of the earlier writers. We talked about Tennyson and his challenges, Hardy and Houseman and his challenges, Auden, Eliot, the list does go on. We didn't talk about Conrad, I don't think, did we?
We did Conrad.
Oh, did we?
Heart of
Okay,
Darkness. Yes.
yes. Okay, we talked about it with him too. You can actually trace how we got here if you're carefully reading these writers, and Yeats is another step on that journey. So the good and the true and the beautiful are purely relativistic, and therefore they are whatever I want them to be. And I can even force myself to believe that something is good when I didn't originally think that it was good. But I can force myself to believe that, and if I can do that, then that's a valid move. So we see the death of a taste for the good, the true, and the beautiful, as Matthew Arnold said. I also want to talk a little bit about scientism here and the pronouncements of the scientists, which now have not the authority of science and its calculations and the scientific method behind it, but rather a religious authority. You're right to say that. They're high priests. That's who these people are. And if a scientist pronounces X, then to challenge X is not just incorrect potentially, it is the violation of a sacred taboo, just like old religious violations were a violation of a different species than normal everyday violations. And the outrage it generates is of a different and much more extreme species as well.
Yes.
You are
not wrong. You're not wrong. You're vile.
You're a sinner. That's what you are. You're a sinner. You're not a person who's got it wrong. You're not incorrect. You're actually a sinner. And you must be punished accordingly and expunged. And the sin must be expunged, and maybe you are the sin, and then we just head down the rabbit hole from there. We've gotten rather dark, you and I.
Yeah, well, there's always a tendency there, Bill, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And
yes.
what rough beast its hour come round at last slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. It's that sort of a poem, isn't it?
It
and
is.
The indignant desert birds around it.
I thought that was very cleverly done. You don't see the desert birds, you see their wheeling shadows. And of course, if the desert birds are up in the air and you see their wheeling shadows as you walk across the sand, they're anticipating the slaughter. That's why they're up and about.
Yes.
They're here waiting for the slaughter that's going to come, which will glut their appetites for dead flesh.
And when I see the shape of the lion body, the head of the man, I'm thinking the Sphinx, and thinking all of the miasma and the appalling nature of Oedipus's transgression with his mother and the murder of his father. And Yeats doubtless has this in mind as well. And this sort of a social taboo, a cultural taboo, a natural taboo, something which has been broken by humanity itself. Again, the atrocities of the World War and what has been done by man to his fellow man, all of these in the context. I do think poems need to be read in context. This poem needs to be read in the light of the 20th century. It makes sense there. It doesn't make sense elsewhere. If you put this in the 19th century, it would be absurd. If you stuck it in the 18th, even more so. Yeah. I could imagine it in the 17th century at some points, though not in these terms. It would be far more Christian in its understanding of them. Here it's making gestures, it's giving symbols, but the symbols are rather empty, or for the reader to fill with his or her emotions, I guess.
Yeah, it's a poem that is written after the age of good and evil, to reference
Yep.
Nietzsche.
Yep.
Is the coming apocalypse good or bad? That is an irrelevant question to this poem and perhaps to Yeats.
Yes.
It's just what is, and what
And this is why
is.
I'm not a fan of the 20th century. I do not like the literature. I do not like it one little bit. But there are some points of light, and it is very much worth studying. And in its best writers, and I think we're exploring some of them at any rate, I think you can say and note things about the culture which are worth noting. But for me, it starts to become more something that I don't like. It becomes cultural studies rather than the study of literature. That's why I, in general, avoid talking about the 20th century in my classes, because now I've moved away from what I see myself as doing, namely to present beautiful literature and its forms, and then become involved in, as I say, cultural anthropology more. And I think that then becomes more agenda driven.
Yeah, it can insidiously lead you into doing what you and I have lamented all along, and which the fascists and the Bolsheviks wanted very much for art to do, which was to force art to serve the state
Propaganda.
and the cultural ideologies that they are promulgating. And that's the chief function of literature. And so from this perspective here, as we're engaging with Eliot and Auden and Yeats, it's easy to slide almost unguardedly into that approach to literature, where we're talking now first and foremost about the issues and not about the art.
Yeah.
And I think that's always a great loss to the reader who falls into that trap. So like you, I try to steer my students around it. My approach is different than yours. I try to inoculate them from some of the more pernicious tendencies in the 20th century literature, but one can't always do that.
Yeah, fair enough. Do we have anything more to say about Mr. Yeats today?
Oh, probably endless stuff, but we have to draw a line under it somewhere. So
Indeed.
next time around, we are dealing with our man, George Orwell. George Orwell also has many distressing things to say, but in some senses, he's coming at these matters in the middle of the 20th century from a very different perspective with a different series of assumptions. You can't imagine that W.B. Yeats can be easily outraged morally and ethically, not when he's really put in the corner. He gets passionate about certain things, to be sure, I think. But is he outraged at an injustice or something like this? Well, if he's adopting a relativist model of good and evil and justice and all these sorts of things, then no, he doesn't have a basis for that.
No.
On the other hand, George Orwell is one of these writers with whom I disagree on pretty well every issue he cares to discuss. And yet I've got a fair bit of respect for the man himself, but we'll talk about why that is next time around. Dr.
Right.
Masson, is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, not on Yeats. I did want to give a brief update for our listeners that the website paideatoday.com is now up, and we will put all of our episodes up on the website, and also create a place for further announcements, potential master classes, that sort of thing, which we've talked a few times about over the course of the 4 seasons, that we wanted to get back into certain things or do it in greater detail, or even we'd had to skip over things that we would have liked to have dealt with. We may do that in those types of venues, but that's the plan there. The website will be up. We wish that we'd been able to do that earlier, but we've lacked the technological support and editorial support that we needed. So the website will be there, and a means for you to support us in what we do so that we can do it better than we are already doing it. But I think some people, we do have a loyal, small following here, and I think it might be a little bit better served by this new website. So look to that, paideatoday.com, and we'll see you next time when we look at George Orwell. That's us for now. It's Dr. Scott Masson with, again, my colleague Bill Friesen, and we will see you next time.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.